I want to invite you to Acts 11, if you'll open there, please. Acts chapter 11. I'm going to read a couple of verses from that context and then a couple of verses from Acts chapter 12. Acts 11 and verse 27. Now at this time, some prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch, and one of them, named Agabus, stood up and began to indicate by the Spirit that there would certainly be a great famine all over the world. And this took place in the reign of Claudius. Chapter 12, verse 1. Now about that time, Herod the king laid hands on some who belonged to the church in order to mistreat them. And he had James, the brother of John, put to death with a sword. And when he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter also. Now it was during the days of unleavened bread, or you might better know that as Passover. We're going to look at the rest of the story in just a bit, but I just want us to get this part of the story so far, what we've read. And I want to use the context of this story and what God does about this situation, this crisis that the believers in Antioch and the believers in Judea, that they're experiencing, in order to illustrate some truths that I think we can all relate to. And I hope that at the end or at the conclusion of our conversation together today about this text, that we'll be able to relate to it even more than what we might even be able to relate to at the beginning. The first truth that I want you to see from the situation of this worldwide famine and from this suffering that's being endured by the Christians in Jerusalem with the death, the beheading of James, and now with the arrest of Peter, the truth that I want us to see in that is this: believers will be burdened by life, and they will be burdened by faith, and often by both simultaneously. Believers will be burdened by life, and they will be burdened by faith, and they will oftentimes find themselves burdened by both of those things, both by life and faith at the same time. Now, let me define what I mean by those two burdens a little bit more from our context. There was, in these days, when these things are unfolding, when they're happening, there was a famine that everybody in the world was experiencing during the reign of Claudius. And we know what famine is. Maybe we've not experienced that in our own life and in our own world, unless in our civilization, in our part of the world, than what would even today be experienced by other parts of the world. But a famine means that you don't eat, right? It means there is no crop. It means there's nothing in the barn. It means there's nothing in the cupboard. It means that you don't have food. And so there is this experience that's going on at this time where there is this famine that has impacted the world at that time. And believers are not immune to that. That is life stuff, right? That kind of thing happens. It happens then, it happens today. And believers are not immune to that kind of burden, to that kind of affliction. It's a part of life under the sun. It's a part of the curse of sin that has all come since the garden. It's a common experience. So there is that burden. The second burden, though, is a burden that they are experiencing because of the fact that they are believers. If James were not a Christian, James would not have been put to death by Herod. But the very reason why James is executed by Herod is because James is a believer, and not just a believer, he's a leader among the believers. He was one of the 12 apostles. And so that's exactly the reason why he experiences that burden, and why his family and why the community of Christians in Jerusalem suffer It's all because of their faith. And so their faith puts them in that situation where, in this case, they're being persecuted by the king in their land. And that burden is now exacerbated by the fact that Herod gets away with it. The Jewish people, who are the predominant population in the city and in the region, they celebrate Herod's actions. And so as a result, Peter then is imprisoned as well. And the expectation is that it's going to end for Peter the same way that it did for James. And in fact, Herod is planning to make a bigger show of it, because he's going to do it during the Passover for maximum political capital. He wants as many people as possible to see, if they were excited about James, then how excited are they going to be to see Peter die? And so that's the plan. Now, that is just the way it is. I mean, that's a truth about your faith and about my faith and about anyone who puts their trust in God. There are going to be burdens that we as believers are going to experience that are burdens of life, that are just the common experience of everyone. And there are going to be burdens that are the consequence of putting your trust in God, and of what enemies that makes, or of what of how that puts you at odds or creates an awkwardness in your life. And so they're experiencing here both of those burdens. And even the first burden is to some extent escalated because of their faith. The worldwide famine would be one thing, but for a people who are ostracized from their local population, then that burden even becomes exaggerated too. In fact, if we were to read at the end of chapter 12 in Acts, we would find out that there was enough grain in Judea that Herod was sending it to other places. The cities of Tyre and Sidon were getting food from Judea. Now, why aren't the Christians getting that food? Well, because they're Christians, that's why. And so there are burdens that come from life, and there are burdens that come as a consequence of our faith. Now, I want to say one more truth that relates to the first one, and that is this. God's apparent complacence about these burdens. God's apparent, and I want to underline that word and capitalize it and bold it to emphasize it. God's apparent complacence about the life burden and about the faith burden that is experienced by believers has two results. It will be interpreted by bystanders, by those who are watching believers and who are observing what they see to be God's complacence about their burdens. It's going to be interpreted by bystanders as a proof of the vanity of that faith. Like, they put their faith in God, and they're hungry just like we are. In fact, they're more hungry than we are because of how their faith has alienated them from the community. And look at what's happened to their leaders. And so bystanders look at the burdens that are experienced by believers, and they are apt to interpret those burdens and God's apparent complacence as being a sign that faith is vain. A second circumstance that can result from that is that the wicked can see God's apparent complacence as permission to be more wicked still. Does that make sense? Because God didn't do anything, because God didn't intervene, because God didn't stop their hand, the wicked can see that apparent complacence of God as being a sign or being permission to be even more wicked than what they were. Now, I want you to see that both of those things are true in this context. And so look, if you would, at what happens when Herod puts James to death. And James isn't the only one that suffers. It says that he laid hands on some who belonged to the church in verse 1 in order to mistreat them. James is just one of them. He's one that we all know. And so that's the reason why he's highlighted. And so he had James, the brother of John, put to death with a sword. And when he saw that it pleased the Jews. And so in the truth that I've just described, they are the bystanders. They're watching what Herod has done, and they're looking at this, and they see in that the vanity of the faith of this community who's put their trust in God, and now one of their leaders is dead, and one of their leaders is in prison, and others have suffered too. And then we see Herod, who's the instigator of this persecution. It says, when he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter also. And so he's been encouraged. God's apparent complacence has given him reason or permission to be even more wicked than what he's been so far. Now, does that still go on? Does it still happen? That God's apparent complacence causes those who look at faith to say, I mean, why would I want to be a part of that? I mean, what's the good in that? And so they see vanity in it. Or the wicked see that they get away with stuff, and even get away with stuff against the innocent, or get away with stuff against the community of faith, and so take that as permission that they can be more wicked than what they've been. Now, out of this circumstance, the Jews feel a certain kind of vindication as bystanders. In fact, they might even interpret Herod's actions, the fact that Herod was able to put James to death and able to put Peter in prison, as a demonstration that they may not approve of Herod, but they may approve of what Herod's done. That Herod got it right this time, or that God through Herod got it right. You see how they interpret how they could interpret what it is that's going on. And so they feel a certain vindication and victory in what's occurred. And Herod feels empowered to just do what he wants because of what benefit it will give him politically. The Jews are happy. He's glad for them to be happy, because oftentimes they aren't happy with him, but they're happy now. And so he wants to make the most of that. Well, we know how the Jews feel. We know how Herod feels. Now, how you're in the church in Jerusalem, how do you feel about that? And what's your attitude when you go to work tomorrow? And when you're trying to figure out, how are you going to feed the family this week? Because the burden of what's happened with James and the burden of what's happened with Peter is on top of the burden that you were already feeling about the fact that we're hungry. And so where is God in all of that? I mean, where is He in the hurt? Where is He in the burden of life? And where is He in the burden of faith? How does He feel about what's going on? What is He doing about that? And so what's the spirit, what's the climate of the church when they get together and when they worship? What's it like? What's the sermon that Sunday after James is dead? What did the people say at James's funeral? What kind of words were exchanged at his wake? What did they say? I don't know if James was married or not. What did they say to his wife and to his children? And we know that Peter is married. How is his family feeling right now as he's in jail? And it looks like Herod is going to get away with it again. A third principle, third truth that I want us to consider in this context is this. Believers spend much of their time in the awkward in-between of manifold burdens and unknown outcomes. Now, I want to say to you that where we live most of the time is in the awkward in-between of something happened that didn't feel so good. There's a famine. But the burden is manifold. It's multi-layered, because on top of the burden of being hungry, now there's the burden of what's happened to James and his family. And on top of that is now what's happening with Peter. And on top of that, or surrounding that, mixed in with all of that, are all the other people whose names that we don't know, but you can be sure that they knew them in Jerusalem. There are other people that are hurting too. And so there's lots of collateral damage. And much of our life is spent in the awkward in-between of manifold burdens and of uncertain outcomes. How is this going to play out? What's going to happen to Peter? Nobody in Jerusalem knew what was going to happen to Peter. Not Peter, not any of the other apostles, nobody knows what's going to happen. Nobody knows how the famine's going to end. Nobody knows when or if Herod's going to stop. Now, I want the story to be relatable to us, because that's where you live and that's where I live every day, don't we? I mean, there are burdens that come from life and burdens that come from faith, and they're all stacked up. And what we don't know is just how that's going to play out. What is the result going to be? And so the believers in Jerusalem, they don't know when. They don't know where. They don't know how God is going to show His hand in the midst of all of these burdens. But I tell you what they do know. They know that He will. They know that He will. Now, they don't know when He will. They don't know how He will. They don't know where He will. But they know that He will. That He will do that. That He will show His hand. Now, how do we know that they knew that? Well, we know that because of how they behaved. If we read next in the story, if you go to chapter 12, and you look at verse 5, you read about how Peter was being kept in prison. And they wanted to make sure he stayed there because they had 4 quaternions of soldiers who were watching him. That's a quaternion was 4 soldiers. And you know, you didn't put wimps in quaternions. I mean, these are guys who are prepared. They are prepared for trouble. They're prepared for crisis. They're armed to the teeth, and they're guys who are they're a band of brothers. The quaternions are, and so they've got 4 quaternions, which means they've got 16 soldiers who are keeping watch over Peter in a prison. And he is in a cell behind a door, and he is chained in the cell behind the door. And he has a soldier on either side of him. I mean, in the cell with him. Outside the door of the cell are more guards. That's the first guard. And then there's a second guard that's beyond that. And then there's an iron gate between the prison where they're keeping him and the rest of the city. And so Peter is, we could safely say, well secured where he is. That's where he is. And the Passover has just come to an end, and it's the next day. Herod is planning to bring him out in front of the people. And so Peter's there in prison, and so what are believers doing in the midst of this manifold burden of life and of faith? Well, they're in the home of a lady named Mary, who had a son named John Mark, and who had a little servant girl named Rhoda. And not all of the believers are there. It seems like maybe they were in different places, because we know that some of the leadership was not there. We learn later on in the story, James, the Lord's brother, isn't there, and others aren't present. But a lot of believers are in Mary's home, and guess what they're doing? You get one guess. They're praying. The people are there and they're praying. It says in verse 5, so Peter was kept in the prison, but prayer for him was being made fervently by the church to God. And on the very night when Herod was about to bring him forward, Peter was sleeping. between two soldiers bound with two chains. Now, there is as much said about Peter's posture as there is about the posture of the saints. They're praying for Peter, and what's Peter doing the night before he's about to be brought out? He's just sleeping. He's sleeping. And his composure in the midst of the burdens that he's experiencing, and the composure of the believers in the midst of the burdens that they're experiencing, says a lot about what they see in all of this. They don't know when, they don't know where, they don't know how God is going to show His hand, but they believe God is going to do something about all of this. There's no guarantee, though, that it's going to play out the way that they would really like for it to play out, but they trust that God's hand is in this somewhere, both in the life burden and in the faith burden that they're experiencing. A fourth principle that I want you to see in the story, and that's this. You may not believe this, especially in the experience of it, but I want us to see in this story it's true. And if we can relate to the burdens of the story, then we need to relate to this truth as well. And the truth is this: there is wisdom in God's weight. There is wisdom in God's weight. If God leaves us burdened with life, or if God leaves us burdened because of our faith, that's not a sign of complacence as outsiders might see it. It's not permission for more wickedness the way that Herod might see it. There is much wisdom in God waiting. And there are things that God does in that waiting time. And there are things that God does with believers during that waiting time that is the working out of His wisdom. That is the reason why He waits. Now, we don't always know when He's going to wait. We don't always know how long He's going to wait. We don't always know why He's waiting. But what we do need to learn to trust is the wisdom of God in the wait. We need to have confidence that there is good reason for His waiting. And so that then gives us confidence in how we behave during the wait. Could I just say a few things to you about the wisdom that's a part of the wait? Number one, we show God more faith when all of the comfortable reasons for faith are removed, do we not? I mean, when I show faith in God and the barn is full and the fields are ripened to harvest and the cupboard is full and my job is good and when life is gravy, when I show Him faith in that's good. But when the barn is empty and when the field is black and when there's nothing, there's no crop, and when there is no rain, and when the cupboards are bare, then when I show God faith, what does that look like? And how does that glorify and magnify trust in Him? We show Him more love when our love is sacrificial the way that His love was. When our love cost us something for Him instead of when it cost us nothing, then do you see how much greater our heart is for Him when our love is sacrificial? We show the world more His worth when owning God means that we lose freedoms. When owning God means that we lose friends. When it means that we lose sleep. When we lose tears. When we lose health. When we lose wealth. When we lose our daily bread. If we're fine with those things flying away because we own God, then what does that say to the world about the worth of God? Do you see the power in that? The wisdom in that? We see better the vanity of the world when the things of the world fly away from us. We see the emptiness in stuff. When our stuff disappears, that it was not so needful, and in fact it distracted me from what was really important. We know better the weakness of our own strength when we, like Peter, find ourselves imprisoned and helpless to do anything about it. We don't trust then when we're made weak in what we can do, but we put our trust in Him. There's nowhere else to put it in those kind of circumstances. We are more wise and we are more provoked by the schemes of Satan when we see how he uses life experiences to deceive the naive and to encourage the wicked. I mean, Satan is made the more heinous when he kills a good man at the hands of Herod. And his schemes are shown to be the more subtle and the more ugly and the more grotesque when he deceives the city by working through a man like Herod so that the Jews applaud what's taking place there. You see, it helps our perspective, the perspective of believers, to realize the warfare that we're engaged in. We are more humble, we are far more humble when we find ourselves with no answers within ourselves, with no army to go and fight against the opponent, with no weapons, with no wealth, with no path of escape, with no strategy within ourselves. That's what makes a man humble, is when I can't do anything to change my circumstance, but I have to count entirely on God to do that. I mean, I need to be in places like that. And part of the wisdom of God is that He puts believers in places like that so that we know our need for Him. Our thirst for God and our hunger for His hand is accentuated when we find ourselves in trial. Our celebration, our jubilance in God is more satisfying when the victory that is experienced, when the victory that finally comes seems impossible and unexpected. Then you got something to sing about. When it looks like there was no way for the waters to be divided and for the sea to be crossed and for Peter to get out of prison. But then when he does, there's unbelievable joy and excitement and celebration. And could I say, in terms of the wisdom that's a part of God's weight, is that our virtuous behavior, our neighborly love, our spirited worship, our certain hope, our contented faith are the more conspicuous in the context of suffering. Let's think about that in terms of just, things that are going on that we can't speak to the details, but we can guess what they were like. How do you think Peter treated the guards that kept him prisoner? Do you think he gave them any lip when they were doing his job and when they're shackling him up? And what kind of prisoner do you think he was there? Do you think that they looked in the prison and they saw Peter and as a man that had just given up hope, that was on the brink of losing his faith? I expect that Peter was, I just expect they loved being around him. I would have expected that he was kind, gracious with the guards that were keeping watch over him. That he was respectful of them as they're going about their duty. And the believers that are hungry in Jerusalem, how are they acting with their neighbors? Don't you reckon that they are just as compassionate, that they're just as friendly, that they're just as concerned, they're sharing what they have off their table with unbelievers that don't have? I just expect that neighborly love and that compassionate service, and that all of those things have not been dampened by their experiences, but are now the more pronounced, and they're the more conspicuous, because what the trial has done is amplified all of the light that is being shown in the midst of their suffering. Now that is God's strategy in all of that. Is that wise? That is so wise? Is that powerful? That is so powerful? I mean, what God is doing in the lives of the believers is the same thing that He did at the cross. He's using the same kind of heart, the same kind of might, the same kind of willingness to hurt for God, He's using all of that to shine the same kind of light when He comes and when He works it out. Now, if the only thing that can blunt the hand of God in this circumstance is what the believers do. Do you see that? The only thing that can blunt the hand of God in this is how the believers behave. This is what I mean. I mean, we already see that. I mean, Herod's got no power over what's going to happen next. And the unbelievers in the community that are bystanders, they have no power over what's going to happen next. Not really. But when the disciples of God, when they get together in Mary's house, and little John Mark is there and he's watching what's going on, and the servant girl Rhoda is a witness to that, then how they behave that night, that does have something with what God can do next. And how Peter behaves in the prison, if he is a foul-mouthed, if he is misbehaving himself, if he has a grudge against the guards, if he has a grudge against life, if he's giving up his faith, then do you see that the angel, he can't come. He can't open up the door. He can't rouse Peter from his sleep. He can't do all of those things. You see, part Peter's behavior is part of what gives God an arena, room in which to act. And so our composure, trusting in the wisdom of God, trusting in the power of God, when we find the burden of life and when we find the burden of faith, is part of what empowers God to act. Faith was made for times like these, was it not? Faith was made for times like this. And God shows up. Here's the last principle I want you to see in this great story. Serendipity is a favorite word of mine. Serendipity is it's a made-up word. It's a word that came from a guy that wrote a story, I can't even remember when, back in the 1800s or 1700s or something, that was about these guys who found fortuitous events happening everywhere they went. They were out having adventures. And so the author made up the word serendipity to describe their experiences as they traveled from place to place. But it's a great word, and what it describes is a sweet surprise. And not just a sweet surprise, but one that is very fortuitous, unexpected, better than expected. God is great at serendipity. God is so good at serendipity. And the thing that I want you to see in this story and in our own experiences is that there is serendipity in the wake of God's wait. There is serendipity in the wake, behind, in the resolution of God waiting. A serendipity, a sweet surprise, a fortuitous faith-building experience that would not have been experienced were it not for the wait. And that's part of the wisdom, is what God works out in that. And so what the wait makes possible is the fact that Peter does fall asleep between the guards. And in the middle of the night, somebody's kicking him or somebody's pushing him. An angel has come in. The room is now illuminated. And he's waking Peter up. He says, "Get up quick." And so Peter gets up. And he says, "Put on your shoes." And so Peter puts on his sandals. And he says, "Wrap your cloak around you." And he does. And the guards stay asleep. And the shackles, they fall off of his hands. And they walk through the locked door. And all of the guards, nobody does anything. Everyone's asleep. And they come to the gate of the prison. And the door, we're told, opens of its own accord. And Peter, he's not expecting to get out of prison. He's expecting to die. Peter doesn't even believe that this is real. He thinks he's having a dream, a vision. And he walks down the street as the angel leads him, and then finally the angel disappears, and Peter comes to himself and he realizes that God has sent his angel to release him, to save him from the hand of Herod. And not only is Peter not expecting this, but all the people that are praying for him, they're not expecting him to get out either. I don't know what they were praying that night, but I expect they were praying, God, make Peter strong. God, help us to continue to be bold. God, give Peter comfort in his last hour. And lo and behold, Peter comes and he knocks at the door. And the little girl Rhoda is so excited when she hears Peter's voice that she doesn't. Have you ever been so excited that what you did next didn't even make any sense? She doesn't open the door. She just goes and tells everybody that Peter's at the door. And the people who are praying for Peter, he's not at the door. He's in prison, Rhoda, you know. And they don't believe it. But they talk long enough about it that somebody says, well, maybe it's his angel that's come. And finally, Peter keeps knocking, and they come back and open the door, and behold, it's Peter. And he says, go tell James and go tell all the brethren. And the people have a great victory. God has brought them a great victory that night. The thing that I want us to see in that is that God is not just doing that in this story. He's doing that all the time with us. There is serendipity in the wake of God's wait. If we wait in faith for God, He will come. And if we show composure of our faith as we wait for God, He will come. And His power in that will be even more magnified. Tell you why I told that story today and why I came to that text. I can't, it was last December, it was actually not last December, it was the December before that Howard and Cindy first came to Chelsea, and Cindy's mom, Peggy Tice, was with them, and she made the move from Hendersonville to Chelsea, or to, well, you know, to that part of town, but they drive all the way to Chelsea. And one Sunday, I think it was, seemed like it was January of last year, Howard and Cindy are sitting in the back with Sister Peggy because she needs to be careful about the crowd because we know at that time that she's sick. And Kristen comes in the door. And she sat next to Peggy and Howard and Cindy on the back row. And Peggy, who knows that she's not going to live very long, and who is a brand new disciple herself, starts telling Kristen about the church here. And tells her, this is where you need to come. I mean, just that bluntly. And shares with her stories about us that were stories that were better than we deserve. And about what God was doing in her life and how He was blessing her, even though her days were few. When I met Kristen after services that day, I introduced myself and she said, I already know who you are. She said, because Miss Peggy, my new best friend, she's told me all about you, and she's told me all about the whole church here. Now, that's a woman burdened with life, burdened with weight, who doesn't make it look like it's a burden. And she had a gracefulness about the way that she carried that weight. And we got to witness that. There aren't many stories where you kind of get to see the end. And we're not just seeing the end, we're seeing one thing that God worked out of that. We're seeing the faith that He's sown in Kristen. And how beautiful that's become. And how beautiful that will become. Because she's going to give that away the same way that Peggy gave that away to her. And we need to be a people that give that away. Because we are a people who, in the midst of the weight, the wake of God's weight, know that we don't know where, and we don't know when, and we don't know how, but God is going to show His hand in this. And when He does, it will be sweet. And when He does, it will be powerful. And when He does, it will be glorious. And He will be magnified in that. And it will be breathtaking when we see. I'm glad, so glad, that God lets us see stories like that give us reason, cause for a greater faith. I know that everyone here is experiencing some life burdens. And maybe some of you right now are experiencing some faith burdens. All of us have some manifold burdens that mean that we are in this kind of holding pattern, in this kind of weight, not knowing what the outcome is going to be. Well, what I want to say to you this morning is that when you put your faith in God, even though you can't see what the outcome is going to be, that you put your faith in the only place that makes sense. You found your life on the only person who can do something to make the outcome something that will be victorious. What about James in the story? James died. James was the most blessed of the whole bunch. James got a crown. The experiences of this life so blind us to the superior experiences of the next. James got to see that, got to celebrate from glory the victory that he watched or that he heard about among the believers that he left behind in Jerusalem. Won't you come to Jesus this morning and won't you put your trust in Him? Won't you do like Kristen did? Confess your faith in Jesus as the Son of God. Make the decision to transform your life for Him. To repent. And to be baptized. So that God can take away your sins the way that He promised. And make you one of His. Won't you come to Him as we stand and as we sing?